Margaret, get your things off my desk. This company doesn't need dead weight.
She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply reached into her bag, set a single folded document on the table, and walked out without a word. What her son-in-law didn't know, what no one in that boardroom knew, was that the paper she just left behind wasn't a resignation. It was the deed. 22 years earlier, when this company was 3 employees and a rented garage, it was her name, not his father's, that the bank had required as guarantor. Her name, quietly, had been on every document since. He had just fired the one person who legally owned the roof over his head. But he wouldn't find that out until Monday morning, when the locks changed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I'm 61 years old. For most of my life, I believed if you built something with your own hands, quietly and honestly, nobody could ever tell you it wasn't yours. I was wrong about the quietly part, not about the honestly. 32 years ago, my husband Daniel and I started Whitfield Precision machining out of a rented garage on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. 2 used lathes, a coffee can full of loose bolts we sorted by hand, and a bank loan nobody wanted to give a 30-year-old machinist and his wife with no collateral to speak of. Daniel ran the floor. I ran everything else, the books, the suppliers, the customers, the late-night calls when a shipment fell through. We slept maybe 5 hours a night for the first 3 years. I remember sitting on the concrete floor of that garage eating gas station sandwiches for dinner because we couldn't justify the cost of a real one, and Daniel looking at me and saying, "One day this is going to be something neither of us can imagine yet." I believed him. I still do. 7 years in, we nearly lost everything. Our largest client at the time, a regional auto parts supplier, filed for bankruptcy and left us holding almost $180,000 in unpaid invoices, money we'd already spent on materials and payroll. The bank that had carried our original loan called it due within 90 days unless we could put up new collateral to restructure. Daniel's name on paper, at that point, meant a small machine shop with more debt than assets. Mine meant something the bank actually wanted. 40 acres of farmland outside Xenia that my mother had left me 2 years earlier, land I'd always assumed I'd farm someday or pass down, not spend. I remember sitting across from a loan officer named Frank Delaney, a serious man with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to be direct with you. This isn't a formality. If the company defaults, the bank takes the land. Not your husband's business, your land." I signed anyway. I didn't tell Daniel how frightened I was, not that night, not for years. I just signed because somebody had to, and because I believed in what we'd built more than I believed in the safety of not risking it. The bank restructured the loan around that collateral, and as part of the arrangement, my attorney set up a holding entity, Doyle Properties LLC, my maiden name, to formally hold the land and later, the building we constructed on it once the company was stable enough to build a permanent facility. Whitfield Precision would lease the ground and the building from Doyle Properties. Daniel knew every detail. It was never a secret between us. It simply never came up with anyone else, because there was never a reason for it to. Psychologists call this quiet risk-bearing, the invisible weight one partner carries to protect a shared future, weight the other people benefiting from it rarely see or remember. Daniel passed 6 years ago, heart sudden, on a Tuesday morning before either of us had finished our coffee. I still remember the sound the mug made hitting the kitchen floor. Our daughter Casey and her husband Bradley stepped in to run daily operations, and I stepped back, not out, back, into a role the org chart called VP of Operations Advisory. Everyone in that building knew what that title actually meant. It meant I was the person who still fixed things nobody else could fix, and did it quietly enough that it stopped looking like fixing at all. Psychologists call this invisible labor blindness. When one person's contribution becomes so consistent that everyone around them stops registering it as contribution at all, it becomes furniture, expected, unnoticed until it's gone. The morning of the board meeting, I made coffee in the same kitchenette I'd stood in for 3 decades. The coffee maker had a hairline crack in the carafe I kept meaning to replace. I never did. It felt like evidence of a life actually lived in. What nobody at Whitfield knew, and what Bradley himself had long stopped bothering to ask about, was that I'd also spent the last 4 years quietly building something of my own. Under my maiden name, Doyle, I ran a small manufacturing advisory practice, Doyle Precision Advisory, helping 2 other family-owned machine shops in Ohio and Kentucky modernize their operations. It started almost by accident, a favor for an old supplier friend who was drowning. It grew into something real. Clients I never mentioned at the dinner table. Contracts worth more than most people in that boardroom would have guessed I was capable of signing. When a person is consistently made to feel their contribution is assumed rather than valued, they tend to do one of 2 things: collapse inward or quietly build. Margaret built. The board meeting that morning wasn't supposed to be unusual. Quarterly review, same conference room we'd used since we renovated the office in 2015. But when I walked in, there was a stranger at the table. Trent Vance. Mid-40s, sharp suit, the kind of handshake that lasts half a second too long. Bradley introduced him as a strategic growth partner who'd be acquiring a 40% stake to help modernize operations and scale into aerospace supply. Nobody had mentioned this to me beforehand. Not Bradley, not my own daughter. Casey sat 2 seats down, eyes on her folder, not on me. For the first 20 minutes, the meeting proceeded almost normally. Quarterly numbers, a supplier update, a brief presentation from Trent's associate about operational synergies that meant nothing specific to anyone listening closely. I asked 2 questions about the due diligence timeline. Bradley answered them quickly, almost impatiently. The way you answer a question you've already decided doesn't matter. Then he said the company needed fresh energy, that my advisory role had run its course, that Trent's team would be bringing in updated systems and a leaner structure. Then he said the sentence I'll remember for the rest of my life, delivered as flatly as a weather report.
Margaret, get your things off my desk.
Get your
This
things
company
off my
doesn't need
desk.
dead weight.
This company doesn't need dead weight. I looked at Casey. She didn't look up. That somehow hurt worse than the words themselves. I stood. I gathered the folder in front of me, and on my way out, I set down the one document I'd brought with me that morning out of habit more than intention. The property tax renewal notice for the plant building, addressed to Doyle Properties LLC. I didn't say a word about what it was. I simply left it on the table and walked out. Notice what Bradley didn't ask. Not whether Margaret agreed. Not what she'd built. Only whether she was still useful to him. Psychologists call this instrumental reduction, treating a person's entire value as a function of their immediate utility, and discarding the relationship the moment that utility appears to end. I didn't go straight to my car. I went first to Bradley's office, 2 doors down, because 30 years of building something with your family doesn't just switch off because a meeting ends. I needed to hear him say it to my face, alone, without an audience. He was already on the phone when I walked in, and he held up one finger, the way you do to a delivery driver, not to family. I waited. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, not cruelty exactly, something closer to relief. I know that wasn't easy to hear, he said. But you have to understand, Margaret, the board, the real board, going forward, needs to see this company as forward-facing. Not built on a garage story from the 90s. Trent's people ran the numbers. Your advisory role costs more in institutional friction than it saves in institutional knowledge. Institutional friction, I repeated. Is that what Casey calls it too? Something flickered across his face. Casey agrees this is the right direction for the company. Did she use those words, or did you? He didn't answer that. He looked back down at his monitor, the universal signal that a conversation is over whether or not the other person has agreed to end it. I want you to notice something in this exchange. Bradley never once said Margaret was wrong about the business. He never challenged her competence. He challenged her fit, a much harder thing to argue against, because it isn't a fact, it's a feeling someone else gets to decide for you. I left his office without another word. I drove home, packed a single bag without really thinking about what I was doing, and left for my sister Ruth's house before I'd even decided that's where I was going. Ruth has lived in the same white farmhouse outside Xenia for almost 40 years, the kind of place where the porch light stays on out of habit more than need. She took one look at my face in the driveway and didn't ask a single question. She put the kettle on, and we sat at her kitchen table the way we had after every hard thing either of us had ever survived. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "Margaret, nobody gets to decide what you're worth just because they stopped noticing." Then she set her mug down and said, "There's something you should know. About 6 weeks ago, your cousin Linda mentioned that a man had called the county recorder's office asking questions about the plant property. Ownership history, liens, that sort of thing. Linda didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't either, until just now." 6 weeks. That meant Trent Vance's team had been quietly digging into the property records, the one thread that could unravel their entire plan. A month and a half before Bradley ever said a word to me about restructuring. When someone begins quietly investigating the legal and financial foundation of a person's life while continuing to treat them normally in public, psychologists call this a form of coercive positioning, softening the ground for a confrontation the other party doesn't yet know is coming. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "You remember what Mama used to say. The quiet ones aren't the weak ones. They're just the ones who already know how the story ends and don't feel the need to announce it." I stayed at Ruth that night. I didn't sleep well. I lay in her guest room, same quilt she'd had since our mother passed, and stared at the ceiling, turning it all over. This wasn't a company simply deciding to modernize. This was a plan, timed, deliberate, built around the assumption that I either didn't know what I owned or wouldn't have the nerve to use it. While I was lying awake at Ruth's, something else was happening back at the plant that I wouldn't learn about until much later. Priya Anand had worked the floor at Whitfield Precision for 11 years, the last 4 as plant manager. She was 38, sharp, and fiercely loyal to the company, not because anyone had asked her to be, but because it was the first place that had ever given her real responsibility. She had 2 kids at home and a mortgage that depended on that job continuing to exist in something recognizable as its current form. That evening, working late to finish a shipment schedule, Priya overheard Bradley and Trent in the small conference room off the main floor, door not quite closed. She hadn't meant to listen, but certain words have a way of stopping you in a hallway whether you intend to stop or not. "Monterey," she heard Trent say. 18 months, maybe less if the transition goes smoothly. Priya knew exactly what that meant for the 63 people who worked that floor. She also knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a decade learning how a company actually runs versus how it appears to run on paper, that nobody had said a word about this to the plant staff, to the union rep, or, as far as she could tell, to Margaret. She didn't say anything that night. She went home, made dinner for her kids, and sat at her own kitchen table long after they'd gone to bed, turning over a decision that had real consequences either way. Speaking up could cost her the job she needed. Staying silent could cost 63 people theirs, without any of them ever getting the chance to see it coming. Her mortgage was 11 years from being paid off. Her oldest was starting community college in the fall, tuition money already stretched thin across a budget she'd built and rebuilt a dozen times. She thought about all of it that night, spreadsheet open on her laptop beside a half-finished cup of tea gone cold, running the numbers the way she ran every hard decision in her life. Carefully, honestly, refusing to let fear make the choice for her before the facts had a chance to. She thought, too, about the 63 families who had no idea their futures were being quietly negotiated away in a conference room. Most of them had never even been inside. She thought about her own father, a machinist himself, who'd lost his job of 19 years when his plant relocated without warning, and the particular kind of grief that isn't really about the job at all, but about learning that loyalty only ever runs in one direction if you let it. She didn't decide that night. She decided 3 nights later, after watching Bradley walk the floor with Trent, gesturing at machines like they were line items instead of the tools 63 people used to feed their families, and something in her simply settled into place the way decisions sometimes do. Not with certainty, exactly, but with the quiet understanding that she would rather live with the risk of speaking than the certainty of having stayed silent. This is the quiet moral weight ordinary people carry inside organizations every day. The choice between protecting themselves and protecting people who don't yet know they need protecting. Priya didn't sleep much either that night, 3 miles away from where I lay awake at my sister's house, neither of us yet knowing we were about to become allies in the same fight. The next morning, I opened my laptop at Ruth's kitchen table and started pulling threads. Old emails, board minutes from the last 18 months, correspondence with Doyle Properties, attorney about the lease renewal that was due in 4 months. Before I went further, I thought about something small I'd nearly forgotten. 8 months earlier, Priya had called me on a Saturday because the shop's inventory software had crashed before a Monday shipment deadline. I'd driven in and fixed it myself, no charge, the way I always did. I hadn't thought about that afternoon since. Then, at a little past 11 that night, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, 4 words. They think you're finished. Don't let them be right. I stared at it a long time. I didn't recognize the number, but there was something in the phrasing, careful, urgent, close, that made me set the phone down instead of dismissing it. I kept reading. 2 hours in, I found what I hadn't wanted to find. An email chain from 10 weeks earlier, Bradley and Trent copying only each other. They'd been planning this for months. The plan included a timeline for pushing me out before finalizing the sale, a strategy for managing Casey's sentimentality, and one line from Trent that I read 3 times. Once the legacy issue is resolved, we move the tooling contracts to the Monterey facility within 18 months. Cleaner margins, no local entanglements. They weren't just pushing me aside. They were planning to gut the plant, the one Daniel and I had built with our hands, and move the work out of the country the moment I was no longer in the room to object. This is what's called strategic devaluation. Convincing yourself a person's objections don't matter by first convincing yourself their presence doesn't matter. I didn't stop there. Something about Trent's confidence, the ease with which he'd walked into that boardroom like he already owned it, made me curious about where else he'd done this before. I searched his name alongside acquisition, family business, and restructuring. It took almost an hour of digging through old regional business press before I found it. 4 years earlier, Trent Vance had orchestrated a nearly identical acquisition of a family-owned textile company in Georgia. A company also founded by a couple, also inherited by a son-in-law after the founder's death, also relocated to a facility overseas within 2 years of Trent's involvement. The company no longer existed under its original name. The founding family's remaining member, an elderly woman named Colette Ferris, had given one brief quote to a local paper at the time. "I don't recognize what's left of it, and I don't think I'm supposed to." I sat with that for a long time. This wasn't a first attempt. It was a method. A playbook Trent had run once already, successfully enough to run it again. Psychology note. What Trent Vance was practicing is sometimes called predatory pattern replication, a strategy so effective the first time that it stops requiring improvisation, only new, unsuspecting targets. I closed the laptop somewhere near 2 in the morning. Ruth had gone to bed hours before. I sat in the quiet of that kitchen, the refrigerator humming, and made a decision. Not revenge, that was never in me, but I was done being invisible to the people counting on my invisibility to get what they wanted. The next afternoon, I did something I almost talked myself out of. I called Casey and asked her to meet me for coffee, just the 2 of us, no Bradley, no folders. She came. She looked tired in a way I hadn't let myself notice in the boardroom, dark circles she'd covered imperfectly, a stillness in her that wasn't calm so much as braced. "Mom, I need you to understand this isn't personal," she said before I'd even finished sitting down. "The company needs capital we don't have. Trent's group is the only serious offer we've gotten. Bradley thinks." "I'm not asking what Bradley thinks," I said. "I'm asking what you think." She was quiet for a moment. "I think we're drowning a little, and I think you've always made drowning look so effortless that none of us ever really learned how to swim without you." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even entirely wrong. But it told me something important, that Casey genuinely believed the story she and Bradley had built for themselves. She wasn't lying to me. She was, I think, still lying a little to herself. Casey, did you know Trent's team was asking questions about the plant's property records 6 weeks before this deal was ever brought to the board? Her expression shifted just slightly. What are you talking about? I'm asking if you knew. No, she said, and I believed her, the same way you believe someone who has just realized they've been handed only part of a story and is only now noticing the missing pages. No, I didn't know that. I didn't push further. I'd learned enough from that conversation, and pushing would have only closed the door I was trying to keep open a crack. If you've ever had a conversation like this with someone you love, where you can see they're standing on ground that isn't as solid as they believe, you understand the particular ache of choosing not to say everything you know, yet. Have you ever had to hold back the full truth from someone you loved, waiting for the right moment to say it? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear how you handled it. 3 days after I left the plant, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of someone used to making consequential decisions without needing to raise it. Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Walter Ibsen. I believe we need to talk. Walter Ibsen was CEO of Ibsen Aerospace Components, Whitfield Precision's largest customer, responsible for nearly a third of our annual revenue. We worked with his company for 11 years. I'd personally handled that relationship since the very first contract. We agreed to meet the next morning at a quiet cafe near the river in downtown Dayton. Walter arrived exactly on time, silver-haired, no tie, a manila folder under his arm that he set on the table without opening right away. I'm going to be direct with you, Margaret, because I think you've earned that, he said. 2 days ago, my office received an anonymous email. It contained an internal recording and a set of documents concerning Whitfield Precision's ownership structure and a planned acquisition. He opened the folder, printed emails, a transcript, property records with Doyle Properties LLC highlighted in yellow. The recording is a phone call between Bradley Whitfield and Trent Vance, made 10 days ago. I'll play it for you if you're ready. I nodded. He pressed play on a small recorder. Bradley's voice, casual, certain no one but Trent could hear him. Once the deal closes and Margaret's out, we don't need the family angle anymore. Casey will fall in line, she always does. We move the aerospace tooling to Monterey inside 18 months. Ibsen won't like it, but by then the contract's already signed and it's not their call. The recording ended. The cafe noise around us kept going, indifferent to what had just landed on that table. Psychology note: what Margaret experienced in that moment has a name: confirmation collapse. The grief doesn't arrive when you first suspect betrayal. It arrives the instant the last possibility of being wrong disappears. There's a second recording, Walter said, more quietly this time. Shorter. I want you to hear it before I explain the rest. He played it. 15 seconds. Trent's voice this time, speaking to someone off mic, someone whose voice wasn't captured. Same playbook as Ferris Textiles. Give the family member a title that sounds important and no actual authority. Let them think they're still needed, then cut them loose once the paperwork's signed. Works every time if you're patient. I closed my eyes for a moment. I found that company myself 2 nights ago, Georgia, a textile business. Walter nodded slowly, unsurprised. Then you already understand this isn't improvisation. It's a method he's run before, which means it isn't really about you, Margaret, even though it's happening to you. You're not the first person he's done this to. I'd like to make sure you're the last. There's something else you need to understand, he continued. Our supply contract with Whitfield has a key person and location clause. It requires continued involvement from the individual who has historically managed the technical relationship and the U.S.-based facility guarantee. That's you, Margaret, by name, going back to the contract we signed in 2015. Any change of control that removes you from that role or relocates primary production outside the facility named in that agreement gives Ibsen the right to terminate immediately. Bradley either didn't know that clause existed, or he assumed I'd never notice. I sat with that for a long moment. Then Walter said the thing that mattered more than anything else on that table. I also need to ask you directly, because I won't build a decision on someone else's pain. Do you want this deal stopped? Because if what you're feeling right now is about hurting Bradley, I need you to tell me plainly, and I'll walk away from this conversation and let your family sort it out privately. I thought about that question honestly, the way it deserved to be thought about. Part of me, the part that had stood in that boardroom and heard dead weight, wanted to watch the whole thing come apart. That part was real. I won't pretend otherwise. But I'd learned a long time ago not to make permanent decisions out of temporary pain. I don't want to destroy the company my husband and I built, I told him. I want it protected. Whether Bradley stays in it is not a decision I need to make out of anger. It's a decision the facts should make. Walter nodded slowly. Then I'd like you in the room when this comes to a head. Not to negotiate. You have no formal role in that meeting anymore, and I respect that Bradley technically has the authority to run it. But as the person whose name is on the lease, whose name is on my contract's key person clause, and whose name, frankly, built the trust this company has traded on for 11 years, I think it's time the room understood who they've actually been dealing with. Before he left, Walter mentioned one more thing almost in passing. The anonymous email came from an internal address. I won't tell you who, that's not my information to give, but whoever sent it took a real risk doing so. You might want to think about who at that plant has more to lose than to gain by telling you the truth, and thank them properly in whatever way you're able to once this is over. I had a guess. I didn't act on it yet. That evening, back at Ruth's, my phone rang again. Bradley's number, not a text this time, a call. I almost didn't answer. I did. Margaret, he said, and something in his voice was different, softer, almost rehearsed. I wanted to talk before Monday, off the record. I think there's a version of this where you walk away comfortably, we handle the lease fairly, and none of this gets more complicated than it needs to be. I can have the attorneys draft a generous buyout for the property. You'd never have to deal with any of us again if you didn't want to. I understood, listening to him, exactly what this call was. Not an apology. An offer to make the problem disappear quietly, one more time, the same way I'd disappeared quietly from that boardroom. Bradley, I said, is this you asking me not to come on Monday? A pause, just long enough to answer the question honestly, even though he never said yes. I'm asking you to think about what you actually want out of this. I want the truth in that room, I said. That's all I've ever wanted. I'll see you Monday. I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. Notice what just happened. Bradley didn't offer Margaret fairness. He offered her a price for her silence, dressed up as generosity. There's a difference between being bought and being valued, and it's a difference many people only learn to recognize after they've already been offered the wrong one. I spent that Saturday morning at Denise Ockhafer's office instead of Ruth's kitchen table. Denise had handled Doyle Properties, legal work for nearly a decade, ever since the original loan restructuring, and she was not a woman who raised her voice to make a point land harder. She laid the property records, the lease agreement, and the Ibsen contract's key person clause across her desk in a neat row, the way you'd lay out tools before starting a job you intended to finish correctly the first time. Here, what's true, Margaret, and I want you to hear it plainly before Monday, she said. You are not walking into that room asking for anything. You already own the ground the entire deal is standing on. Bradley and Trent have spent months building a transaction on top of a foundation that legally requires your signature to move at all. The only real question is whether you choose to exercise that leverage quietly, through negotiation, or publicly, in a way that makes the risk to Ibsen impossible to ignore. I don't want a spectacle, I told her. I want the truth to be unavoidable. Those aren't the same thing. Denise almost smiled. No, they're not. And that distinction is exactly why I think Monday will go the way it needs to. We spent 2 hours going through what could happen, every version of how Bradley or Trent might respond, every way they might try to reframe the recordings, minimize the property claim, or paint me as a bitter relative standing in the way of progress. Denise made me say my responses out loud, more than once, until they came without hesitation, without heat, without anything Trent's team could later characterize as emotional rather than factual. "The moment you raise your voice in that room," she said, "you hand them a story they can tell about you instead of the one that's actually true. Let the documents raise their voices for you." I thought about that the entire drive back to Ruth's. I thought about how many years I'd spent doing exactly that inside my own marriage and my own business, letting the work speak instead of demanding credit for it, and how strange it was to realize that the same instinct that had once made me invisible was about to become the very thing that made me impossible to ignore. If you've ever had to prepare yourself to stay calm in a room full of people who expected you to fall apart, you already understand what that Saturday cost me and what it gave me back. The following Monday, the plant's largest conference room filled up fast. Bradley had scheduled what he believed was a routine signing ceremony with Ibsen Aerospace to finalize a new 5-year supply agreement, the deal Trent's investment was supposed to make possible. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat near the center of the table, facing the door. My attorney, a careful, unflappable woman named Denise Ackafer, sat beside me with a folder of her own. At exactly 10 o'clock, Bradley walked in with Trent a half-step behind him, both of them mid-conversation, confident, until Bradley's eyes reached the far end of the table and landed on me. His expression didn't fall right away. It froze, 3 full seconds of stillness, like a photograph taken at exactly the wrong moment. What happens in a moment like that is called a schema rupture. When reality fails to match the story a person has been operating from. Bradley walked in believing this was his deal, his room, his authority. In 3 seconds, that entire story collapsed. Walter moved things forward smoothly, the way people do when they've done this before. "Bradley, Trent, thank you for making time. Before we begin, I want to introduce something into the record. Margaret Whitfield is present today as the sole owner of Doyle Properties LLC, the entity that holds the deed to this facility, and as the individual named specifically in Ibsen's key person clause governing this relationship since 2015. Her presence is not procedural. It's necessary." Bradley's jaw tightened. Casey, seated near her husband, looked at me for the first time in days. Walter opened his folder and set it on the table. 10 days ago, my company received an anonymous recording of a private call between Bradley Whitfield and Trent Vance. I want to play it for everyone in this room. He pressed play. 30 seconds. Bradley's voice, unmistakable, confident, certain he'd never be overheard. "Once the deal closes and Margaret's out, we don't need the family angle anymore. We move the tooling to Monterey inside 18 months. Ibsen won't like it, but by then it's not their call." The room went very quiet. One of Ibsen's attorneys set his pen down carefully. Watch Casey in this moment. She isn't looking at the recorder. She's looking at her husband. What crosses her face isn't the shock of hearing a stranger's scheme. It's the recognition that she was never a partner in this plan. She was its cover story. Walter continued before the silence could settle. "There's a second recording, shorter, of Mr. Vance describing this arrangement as a repeat of a strategy he used to acquire and relocate a family-owned textile company in Georgia 4 years ago, under nearly identical circumstances. My legal team has reached out to the founding family of that company this morning to confirm the details independently." Trent's composure, for the first time since he'd entered that room 8 months earlier, visibly cracked. Those recordings were obtained without consent. They're not admissible." "We're not in a courtroom, Mr. Vance," Denise said evenly. "We're in a business relationship review, and Ibsen Aerospace is entitled to make decisions based on any information relevant to the integrity of its partners, admissible or not." Casey turned to Trent slowly. "You told me the Monterey conversation was exploratory, a 5-year-out possibility, not a plan." Trent didn't answer. He looked instead at Bradley, searching for something to say that would put the room back the way it had been 30 seconds earlier. Nothing came. One of Walter's attorneys spoke evenly. "Given this recording, and the undisclosed relocation plan that directly violates our key person and facility clause, Ibsen Aerospace is suspending all negotiations pending a full governance review. Mr. Vance, given the nature of this call and the pattern it appears to represent, we're also asking you to leave this meeting. Trent stood. He straightened his jacket with the careful precision of a man trying to preserve the last shred of his composure and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. He was never in this because he cared about what Daniel and Margaret built. He was in it for the margin. When the margin required exposure, all that was left was the quiet buttoning of a jacket on his way to the door. Bradley sat very still. Then, finally, he looked at me directly for the first time since I'd walked in. "You own the building." "I've owned the building for 22 years, I said. "I put my inheritance up as collateral to save this company when your father-in-law and I nearly lost everything. I never needed anyone in this room to acknowledge it. I needed them not to plan around erasing it." Walter closed his folder. "Whitfield Precision's lease is up for renewal in 4 months, held by Doyle Properties LLC. Ibsen's continued business is contingent on the terms of that lease and on Margaret's continued involvement in this account. I'd suggest the two of you find a way to work that out honestly, because I have no interest in doing business with a company that can't." They asked me to wait in a smaller office down the hall while the room settled. I sat with a glass of water and looked out at the parking lot where Daniel used to walk the floor at lunch, tools still in his back pocket, and let myself feel, fully, everything I'd been holding at arm's length for a week. It wasn't triumph. It was closer to what you feel when you've carried something heavy for a very long time, and someone finally says, "You can set that down now." About 20 minutes later, a single knock. Bradley stepped in, alone, no folder, no composure left to perform. "I don't know what I expected," he said, standing near the door, not quite meeting my eyes. "I told myself this was a business decision. I think somewhere along the way I let Trent make me believe you were an obstacle instead of the reason there was anything here to fight over in the first place." I didn't say anything right away. Some silences ask to be filled, and some ask to simply be witnessed. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," he said. "I don't think I've earned that. I just needed to say it out loud, to you, without Trent's plan running in the background telling me how to say it." "Thank you for that," I said, and I meant it, even though it didn't undo anything. "It matters more than you probably think it does," hearing it said plainly. He nodded once and left. It wasn't redemption. It was a beginning, small and uncertain, and sometimes that's the most honest thing a person can offer. A little while later, a second knock. Casey stepped in, no folder, no composure left to perform either. "I didn't know about Monterey," she said. "I swear to you, Mom, I didn't know." I believed her. Not because it made things easier, but because I could see it in the way she was standing, reduced, finally, to her actual size. The way people are once the performance is no longer worth maintaining. "I've been the one smoothing things over between you and Bradley for 2 years, she said, telling myself it was just growing pains. I think some part of me didn't want to look too closely at what I'd be responsible for admitting if I did. She sat down across from me. I called our family attorney from the hallway. I asked her to freeze the Vance transaction and to start drawing up terms that reflect what's actually true, your ownership of the property, your role in the Ibsen account, a real seat on the board, not an advisory title that means nothing. I want you to know that's my decision, not something Walter pushed me into. Mine. There's a name for the moment. A person finally sets down a performance they've been maintaining under pressure. Therapists call it the drop. I sat with that for a long moment. There was a version of this conversation I could have used as a weapon, reminding her of every quiet week I'd spent building the very foundation Bradley had tried to erase me from. That part of me was real. I let it move through me. Then I set it down. "I don't want to destroy what you and Bradley have built together, Casey," I said. "I never did. I just needed this family to understand what almost got thrown away." She nodded, and for the first time in a very long time, she looked like my daughter again instead of someone performing being fine. "I want to pause here and ask you something. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have let Bradley stay involved in the company at all after everything you just heard? Or would you have insisted on a clean break? Type 1 for a second chance, type 2 for a clean break. I'll tell you what Margaret decided in just a moment. That evening, driving back toward Ruth's, I stopped at the plant on impulse and found Priya still on the floor, finishing a late shift the way she so often did. I asked her, plainly, if she was the one who'd sent Walter that email. She hesitated, and then she told me everything, the overheard conversation, the sleepless night at her own kitchen table, the fear of losing her job weighed against 63 people who had no idea their futures were already being quietly negotiated away. I didn't do it for a reward, she said. I did it because you drove over on a Saturday to fix my laptop for free, and never once made me feel like I owed you anything for it. I figured the least I could do was make sure somebody with the power to stop this actually knew it was happening. I stood there for a moment, unable to speak the way you sometimes can't when gratitude and grief arrive in the same breath. Psychology note: what Priya practiced is sometimes called moral courage under asymmetric risk, acting to protect people who don't yet know they need protecting, at a cost that falls entirely on yourself if you're wrong about how it will be received. You didn't just protect me, I told her. You protected everyone on that floor who has no idea how close they came to losing everything. I won't forget that. She just nodded, the way people do when they're trying not to cry in front of someone they respect. 6 months later, the lease was renegotiated on fair terms, with Doyle properties formally recognized on every document instead of quietly standing behind them. I took a real board seat, not an advisory title, with actual voting rights attached to it. Bradley stayed on as COO under new governance terms that Ibsen's legal team insisted on, terms that required my sign-off on any relocation or ownership change going forward. He and Casey started counseling together, not just about the marriage, but about the kind of company and the kind of family they actually wanted to build going forward. Trent Vance's stake never closed. I heard later, through Walter, that the Ferris family in Georgia had opened a formal inquiry into his prior dealings, and that 2 other companies had come forward with similar stories once the first one became public. Priya was promoted to Director of Operations, with a seat at the monthly leadership meeting she'd never had access to before. I made sure of that personally, and it was one of the easiest decisions I've made in years. I called Ruth the week the papers were finalized and told her everything, Doyle Precision Advisory, the deed, all of it. She was quiet for a moment, the way she gets when something moves her all the way down. Margaret, she said, I always knew you were carrying more than you let on. I laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks. This is what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. Not returning to where you were before, but arriving somewhere new, with more clarity about what you built and what you're actually worth. About a month later, I ran into Casey outside a coffee shop downtown. She was alone, no folder, an ordinary cup of coffee in both hands. She looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like a person and not a performance. She told me the Ibsen contract had been fully restored, and that she and Bradley had started rebuilding their working relationship on entirely different terms. Real conversations instead of assumptions. Real decisions instead of quiet defaults to whoever spoke most confidently in the room. I keep thinking about something you used to tell me when I was in high school, she said. You said, never let anyone convince you that quiet means small. I think I forgot that for a while. I think Bradley never learned it at all, not until Monday. Psychologists call this embedded mentorship. Influence delivered so consistently over years that the person carrying it doesn't recognize it until the exact moment they need it most. I didn't comfort her with easy words. That wouldn't have been honest, and she deserved better than that, even now. But I had no bitterness left to hand her either. I'd set that down somewhere in a conference room with Walter Ibsen's recorder on the table, and I had no interest in going back for it. I hope the 2 of you find your footing, I told her, and I meant it completely. She nodded once, and we sat together a while longer, not saying much, which was its own kind of conversation. 1 year later, Whitfield Precision held its 33rd anniversary celebration on the plant floor itself. Tables set up between the machines Daniel had once run himself. String lights hung along the rafters by employees who'd stayed late the night before just to see it done right. I stood near the back for most of it, the way I always had, watching rather than being watched. Casey gave the opening remarks that year, not Bradley, a change nobody had needed to vote on. It had simply become obvious over the preceding months that she was the one people trusted to say true things plainly. She talked about the company's founding, about Daniel, about the mistakes the last 2 years had taught all of them, and then she said something that caught me off guard. "There's a reason this company survived nearly getting sold out from under itself," she said, looking out at the room instead of at me. "It's because someone believed in it enough 30 years ago to risk everything she had, not just her time, her actual inheritance, to keep it standing. Most of you never knew that until this year. I didn't fully know it myself until I had to." She raised her glass. To Margaret Whitfield, not the advisory title, the actual foundation. I won't pretend I didn't cry a little. 30 years of building things quietly doesn't prepare you for the particular shock of being seen, all at once, in a room full of people who mean it. Priya found me afterward, near the coffee station, her youngest daughter asleep against her shoulder despite the noise around them. "I brought the kids because I wanted them to see this place," she said. "I wanted them to understand that doing the right thing when it's inconvenient is just something you tell children to make them behave. It's something that actually changes what happens next, sometimes." "You changed what happened next," I told her. "Don't let anyone, including yourself, shrink that down to a smaller story than it actually is." She smiled, the tired, genuine smile of someone who has finally allowed herself to believe the risk was worth taking. Bradley found me near the end of the evening, glass of sparkling cider in hand, instead of the whiskey he used to favor at these things. "I've been in counseling with Casey for a year now," he said. "I don't know if I've earned the right to say this, but I think I finally understand the difference between running a company and deserving to be trusted with one. I'm trying to close that gap. Slowly." "I've noticed," I told him, and I meant it. The new governance terms hadn't just protected the company on paper. They'd forced Bradley into a version of accountability he'd never had to practice before, and something in him had, however imperfectly, begun rising to meet it. Trent Vance's name came up once that evening, briefly, when one of the board members mentioned that the Georgia textile family had reached a settlement in their case, and that 2 more families, one in Tennessee, one in North Carolina, had come forward with strikingly similar stories once the pattern became public. I felt no satisfaction in it, exactly. Just a quiet, settled relief that the pattern had finally run out of places to hide. Walter Ibsen sent a card instead of attending in person, a short handwritten note that read simply, "Some partnerships are worth protecting because of what they're built on, not just what they produce. Congratulations on 33 years, Margaret. Here, to the next 33 being built on solid ground, the way the first ones actually were, even when no one else could see it." I kept that card. I still have it, tucked into the same drawer where I keep Daniel's old pocket notebook, the one where he used to sketch tooling designs on his lunch break, 30 years and 100 lifetimes ago. That evening, back home, I sat in the reading chair by my kitchen window, the one with the same hairline-cracked coffee carafe I still hadn't replaced, and watched the sun go down over the yard Daniel, and I had planted the first spring after we opened the shop. I thought about what my sister Ruth said the last time we talked on the phone, while I was making dinner and she was half watching the evening news. "The best thing about the truth," she said, "is that it doesn't need you to defend it. It just needs you to be standing next to it." I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I thought, too, about Priya, sitting at her own kitchen table on the night she decided to send that email, carrying a risk that had nothing to do with her own advancement and everything to do with doing the right thing for people who would never even know her name if she hadn't. I thought about Frank Delaney, the lone officer from 30 years ago, sliding that paperwork across his desk and telling me plainly what I stood to lose. I thought about Daniel and the concrete floor of that garage and the sandwiches and the promise he made me before either of us had any real reason to believe it. One day this is going to be something neither of us can imagine yet. He was right. He just never got to see exactly what it would take to protect it. This story reminds us of something most of us already know, but rarely say out loud, that the person who quietly holds everything together is often the last one anyone thinks to ask before making a decision that affects them. Maybe you know someone like Margaret. Maybe you know someone like Priya, who took a real risk to protect people who didn't even know they needed protecting. Maybe you've been someone like Margaret yourself, the one who fixed things without being asked, who carried more than anyone realized, who folded her own worth away quietly because no one else seemed to be counting it. If that's you, here's what I want you to do tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. Find one thing in your home that is entirely, unmistakably yours. A kitchen table, a chair by a window, a worn recipe card in your own handwriting. Sit with it for a moment, not to prove anything to anyone, just to notice that it's yours, that no one else's opinion of it changes what it means. That is where self-respect actually lives. Not in a boardroom, not in the moment someone finally admits they were wrong. It lives in the quiet evening when you already know exactly who you are. And that is enough.